The gunshot echoed through the late afternoon air as Ruby James ducked behind a barrel outside the Granite Creek General Store, her heart racing wildly in her chest. It was 1876 in Montana Territory, and what should have been a simple trip to town had turned into a nightmare. The stagecoach robbery had caught everyone by surprise, and now Ruby found herself separated from the other passengers, hiding from the masked bandits who were still terrorizing the main street of Granite. "Nobody move," shouted one of the outlaws, his voice rough as the gravel beneath his boots. "Empty your pockets and nobody gets hurt." Ruby clutched her reticule tightly, her fingers tracing the outline of her mother's wedding ring tucked safely inside. It was all she had left of her family after losing her parents to typhoid fever last winter. That ring represented everything she had loved and lost, and she'd be damned if some outlaw would take it from her. The sound of horse hooves pounding against dirt drew closer. Ruby peered cautiously around the edge of the barrel, catching sight of a rider approaching fast from the southern end of town. He rode tall in the saddle, his broad-shouldered silhouette unmistakable against the setting sun. "Somebody get the sheriff." A woman screamed from inside the general store, but the rider was moving faster than any lawman Ruby had ever seen. He dismounted in one fluid motion, his duster billowing around him as he drew his revolver with practiced ease. The outlaws, distracted by their robbery, didn't notice him until he fired a warning shot into the air. "That'll be enough of that, boys," the stranger called out, his voice deep and steady. "Drop those weapons before I put holes in you." The bandits turned, startled by the interruption. For a moment, nobody moved. Then one of the outlaws, clearly the leader, laughed. "You're outnumbered, mister, 3-1. The stranger didn't flinch. "Then it's an unfair fight. You should have brought more men." What happened next unfolded so quickly that Ruby barely had time to register it. Two of the bandits reached for their guns, but the stranger was faster. His first shot caught one outlaw in the shoulder, sending him tumbling from his horse. The second shot disarmed another, the man's pistol flying from his hand as he howled in pain. The leader of the bandits, seeing his companions fall, made a desperate lunge toward Ruby's hiding spot. Before she could scream, he grabbed her by the arm, yanking her to her feet and using her as a shield. "Back off," he shouted at the stranger, pressing his gun against Ruby's temple. "Or the lady gets it." Ruby felt the man's hand dive into her reticule, searching frantically. His fingers closed around her mother's ring, and a strangled cry escaped her throat as he pulled it out. "Nice little bonus," the bandit sneered, pocketing the ring before returning his attention to the standoff. The stranger hadn't moved, but something in his eyes changed, a flicker of cold determination that made Ruby shiver despite the warm evening air. "Last warning," the stranger said calmly. "Let the lady go." The outlaw tightened his grip on Ruby. "Throw down your gun first." For a tense moment, it seemed like neither man would back down. Then, to Ruby's surprise, the stranger slowly lowered his weapon to the ground. "There now," he said. "No need for anyone else to get hurt today." The outlaw's grip relaxed slightly, which was all the opening the stranger needed. In a lightning-fast movement, he produced a second, smaller pistol from inside his vest and fired. The bullet grazed the outlaw's hand, causing him to release both Ruby and his weapon with a howl of pain. Ruby stumbled forward and the stranger caught her arm, steadying her as the outlaw clutched his bleeding hand. "You'll hang for this," the bandit snarled, backing toward his horse. "Not before you," the stranger replied coolly. "Now get out of town before I change my mind about letting you leave." The wounded outlaws didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled onto their horses, the leader shooting one final venomous glare in their direction before galloping away, taking Ruby's precious ring with him. As the dust settled on Main Street, townsfolk began cautiously emerging from buildings. The local sheriff finally appeared, looking flustered as he surveyed the aftermath of the robbery. Preston Keller, the stranger, introduced himself to Ruby, tipping his hat. His eyes were a startling blue against his sun-weathered face, and despite the circumstances, Ruby felt a strange flutter in her chest. "Are you hurt, miss?" "Ruby James," she replied shakily. "I'm not hurt, but—" Her voice broke as the reality of what had happened sank in. "He took my ring. My mother's wedding ring. It's all I had left of her." Preston's expression softened. He glanced in the direction the bandits had fled, then back to Ruby's tear-filled eyes. "That's the Blackwell gang," the sheriff announced as he approached. "Been terrorizing stagecoaches across 3 counties." Ruby felt hope drain from her body. If the outlaws were known troublemakers with that kind of reach, she'd never see her mother's ring again. Preston seemed to read her thoughts. He removed his hat, revealing thick, dark hair that curled slightly at the ends. "Miss James," he said with quiet determination, "I'm sorry about your ring." Ruby wiped a tear from her cheek. "It was the last piece of my family I had." Preston's jaw set firmly as he looked toward the horizon where the bandits had disappeared. "Then I'll forge you another from Hope," he said, his voice carrying such conviction that Ruby almost believed him. "I know these hills better than those outlaws ever could. I'll get your ring back, Miss James. That's a promise." Something in his tone made Ruby believe him, despite all logic suggesting otherwise. This man, this cowboy she'd just met, was offering to track down dangerous criminals for a woman he didn't know, all for a simple gold band. "Why would you do that for me?" she asked, bewildered. Preston smiled, and for the first time, Ruby noticed the small crinkles around his eyes, signs of a man who smiled easily despite the hardships of frontier life. "Because it matters to you," he answered simply. "And that's reason enough." As the sheriff organized a group of deputies to search the immediate area, Preston helped Ruby to a bench outside the general store. The townspeople of Granite were buzzing with excitement, but Ruby barely heard them. Her thoughts were consumed by her lost treasure and by the mysterious cowboy who just promised to recover it. What Ruby couldn't know then, as she sat shell-shocked on that bench, was that Preston Keller's promise would change the course of her life forever. The journey to reclaim her mother's ring would lead them both through danger and discovery, across the untamed Montana wilderness, and ultimately into each other's hearts. The sheriff approached them, notebook in hand. "Miss James, I'll need a full statement from you about what happened." He turned to Preston with grudging respect. "You too, Keller, though I can't say I'm surprised to see you in the middle of trouble again." Preston shrugged, unconcerned by the sheriff's tone. "Trouble has a way of finding me, Sheriff Calloway." "Well, you handled yourself well today. Those bandits would have taken more than just the lady's ring if you hadn't shown up." The sheriff tucked his notebook away. "But I can't have you going after the Blackwell gang yourself. That's official business." Ruby's hopes sank, but Preston merely nodded, his expression giving away nothing. Sheriff Calloway seemed satisfied with this response and moved on to question other witnesses. "Don't worry," Preston said quietly once the sheriff was out of earshot. "I meant what I said. I'll find your ring." The sheriff said, "The sheriff says a lot of things." Preston smiled. "But some matters can't wait for official channels. Tell me about this ring." Ruby described the simple gold band with its delicate engraving of intertwined roses. "It's been in my family for 3 generations. My father gave it to my mother when they married, and before she died, she gave it to me." "Where are you staying in Granite?" "I'm not," Ruby admitted. "I was on the stagecoach to Helena. Everything I own was in my trunk on that coach." She gestured toward the overturned stagecoach. I was coming to Montana to start fresh after my parents died. My aunt arranged a position for me as a schoolteacher in Helena. Preston considered this information. The next coach to Helena won't leave until day after tomorrow. He stood, offering his hand to help her up. In the meantime, Mrs. Hollister runs a respectable boarding house on Pine Street. I'll escort you there if you'd like. Ruby took his offered hand, noticing the calluses that spoke of hard work and a life lived outdoors. Thank you, Mr. Keller. You've already done more than most strangers would. As they walked down the main street of Granite, Ruby became increasingly aware of the glances and whispers that followed Preston. Some were respectful, others wary. You seem well known here, she observed. Preston nodded. I've lived in these parts most of my life. My ranch is about 10 miles outside of town. A cattle rancher, horses mostly. I breed and train them. A hint of pride colored his voice. Best quarter horses in Montana territory, if you'll forgive the boasting. They reached the boarding house, a neat 2-story building with a fresh coat of white paint and blue shutters. Mrs. Hollister, a plump, pleasant woman with silver-streaked hair, welcomed Ruby warmly once Preston explained her situation. Of course we have room for you, dear Mrs. Hollister said, casting a knowing look at Preston. Any friend of Mr. Keller's is welcome here. As Ruby signed the guest book, Mrs. Hollister leaned closer to Preston. I heard about what happened in town, those Blackwell boys getting bolder by the day. Preston nodded grimly. Too bold. Sheriff's organizing a posse, but they've got a head start. Mrs. Hollister clucked her tongue disapprovingly. You be careful, Preston Keller. I know that look in your eye. Preston merely smiled and tipped his hat to both women. Miss James, I'll call on you tomorrow if I may. There are some preparations to make if we're going to recover your property. Ruby echoed, surprised. Those men saw your face, Preston pointed out. If they're caught, you'll need to identify them. Besides, it's your ring. You have more right than anyone to be there when it's found. Before Ruby could respond, he bowed slightly and took his leave, boots echoing on the wooden porch steps as he departed. Mrs. Hollister showed Ruby to a simple but clean room on the second floor. You've made quite an impression on our Mr. Keller, she remarked as she opened the curtains to let in the last rays of evening light. I don't know what you mean, Ruby protested. He's simply being kind to a stranger in distress. Mrs. Hollister's smile was knowing. Preston Keller is a good man, one of the best in these parts, but he's not known for getting involved in other folks' troubles. He keeps to himself, and his horses mostly. She smoothed a non-existent wrinkle from the bedspread. So when he offers to chase down the Blackwell gang for a lady he just met, well, that's worth noticing. After Mrs. Hollister left, Ruby sat on the edge of the bed, trying to make sense of the day's events. She'd come to Montana seeking a new beginning after losing everything in Ohio. Now, on her first day in the territory, she'd lost the last piece of her old life and gained the attention of a man unlike any she'd ever known. As night fell over Granite, Ruby stared out her window at the star-filled Montana sky, wondering what tomorrow would bring. One thing was certain. Preston Keller intrigued her. Despite the loss of her precious ring, Ruby found herself looking forward to seeing him again, and that feeling was as unexpected as everything else that had happened since the stagecoach rolled into town. Morning arrived with golden sunshine streaming through the curtains. Ruby dressed in the one spare outfit she'd kept in her smaller traveling bag, a simple blue calico dress that had miraculously survived the robbery. After a hearty breakfast in Mrs. Hollister's dining room, she was just helping clear the dishes when a knock came at the front door. Mrs. Hollister answered it to find Preston standing on the porch, hat in hand. He'd exchanged yesterday's dust-covered clothes for a clean shirt and vest, though he still wore a gun belt around his hips, a practical necessity in the territory. "Good morning, Mrs. Hollister, Miss James," he greeted them. "I hope I'm not interrupting your breakfast." "Just finished, Mrs. Hollister replied cheerfully. "Come in, come in." Preston stepped inside, his tall frame making the cozy parlor seem smaller. "Miss James, I've spoken with some contacts in town. The Blackwell gang was spotted heading toward the Bitterroot Mountains. If we're going to pick up their trail, we should leave soon." Ruby exchanged a glance with Mrs. Hollister, who raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "Mr. Keller," Ruby began carefully, "I appreciate your offer more than I can say, but I can't ask you to risk your life for my mother's ring." The sheriff was right, these men are dangerous. Preston's blue eyes held her steadily. "You didn't ask, Miss James, I offered, and I don't make offers I don't intend to keep. But your ranch, my foreman can manage for a few days." A small smile played at the corner of his mouth. "Unless you've changed your mind about wanting your ring back," Ruby shook her head. "Of course I want it back, it's just—" "Then it's settled." Preston turned to Mrs. Hollister. "Would you be kind enough to pack some provisions for Miss James? Nothing too heavy, will be riding hard." Mrs. Hollister bustled off to the kitchen, leaving Ruby alone with Preston. "Mr. Keller," she said quietly, "I don't know how to ride." This confession seemed to surprise him momentarily, but he recovered quickly. "Then you'll ride with me until we make camp. After that, I'll teach you. It's not difficult once you get the hang of it." Ruby bit her lip, considering. Every practical consideration told her to decline his offer, to wait for the stagecoach to Helena and start her new life without her mother's ring. But something deeper, perhaps the same instinct that had driven her to seek a fresh beginning in Montana, pushed her toward adventure. "When do we leave?" she asked finally. Preston's face broke into a genuine smile that transformed his rugged features. "As soon as you're ready. I've got horses waiting at the livery stable." An hour later, Ruby found herself perched somewhat awkwardly in front of Preston on his magnificent buckskin gelding, while a second horse, a steady-looking sorrel mare, followed behind with their supplies. They'd left Granite behind, following a trail that only Preston seemed able to discern among the rocks and scrub brush. "How do you know which way they went?" Ruby asked, trying to distract herself from the strange intimacy of their position. Preston's arms encircled her as he held the reins, his chest warm against her back. "Tracking is part skill, part instinct," Preston replied, his breath tickling her ear. "See those broken branches? And there the disturbed earth where they watered their horses at the creek." 4 horses, moving fast but not at a full gallop. They're trying to cover ground without wearing out their mounts. Ruby marveled at his ability to read the landscape. "How did you learn to track like this?" "My father was a scout for the army before he started ranching," Preston explained. "He taught me everything he knew about surviving in this country. Good thing, too, it saved my life more than once." As the day progressed, Ruby learned more about the quiet cowboy. His family had been among the first settlers in the territory, establishing their horse ranch when Preston was just a boy. His parents had both passed away several years ago, leaving him the ranch and a reputation as one of the finest horsemen in Montana. "What about you?" Preston asked as they stopped to rest the horses near a small stream. He helped her down from the saddle, his hands strong and sure at her waist. "What brings a young woman from Ohio all the way to Montana territory alone?" Ruby dipped her handkerchief in the cool water, pressing it to her flushed face before answering. "After my parents died, there was nothing left for me in Chillicothe. My father's debts took what little we had. My mother's sister wrote that Helena needed a school teacher, and I've always loved children." She shrugged, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "It seemed like an opportunity for a fresh start." Preston nodded, understanding in his eyes. Montana's good for fresh starts. The land doesn't care where you came from or what mistakes you've made. It only cares how you face each day. Is that what brought your family here? A fresh start? A shadow passed over Preston's face. Something like that. He didn't elaborate further, turning instead to check the horses' hooves for stones. They rode until dusk, when Preston found a sheltered spot near a stand of cottonwood trees to make camp. He moved with the efficiency of a man accustomed to life outdoors, quickly building a small fire and unpacking their provisions while explaining each step to Ruby. "We'll need to keep the fire small," he said as he arranged stones in a circle. "The Blackwell gang won't be expecting pursuit this quickly, but there's no sense in announcing our presence." Ruby helped as best she could, gathering kindling and laying out their bedrolls on opposite sides of the fire. The reality of their situation was beginning to sink, and she was alone in the wilderness with a man she barely knew, chasing after dangerous outlaws. Yet strangely, she wasn't afraid. Something about Preston Keller inspired confidence. Perhaps it was the capable way he moved, or the respect evident in Mrs. Hollister's eyes, or simply the fact that he'd put himself in danger for a stranger's keepsake. As darkness fell completely, they sat beside the fire eating the bread, cheese, and dried meat Mrs. Hollister had packed. The night sounds of the Montana wilderness surrounded them: owls hooting, insects chirping, the occasional distant howl of a wolf. "You think we'll catch them tomorrow?" Ruby asked, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders as the evening chill set in. Preston poked at the fire with a stick, considering. "Hard to say. They've got at least half a day's head start, but they'll be traveling slower now. Men like that tend to think they're safe once they've put some distance between themselves and the law. And are they? Safe, I mean." His eyes met hers across the flames, and Ruby saw something dangerous flicker in their blue depths. "No, Miss James. They most certainly are not." His quiet confidence should have reassured her, but instead it made her wonder just what kind of man Preston Keller truly was. A simple horse rancher wouldn't speak with such certainty about tracking outlaws. There was more to his story than he was sharing. "You should get some sleep," Preston said, breaking the moment. "Tomorrow will be a long day." Ruby nodded, settling onto her bedroll but finding sleep elusive. She watched as Preston checked the horses one last time before sitting with his back against a tree trunk, rifle across his knees. He would keep watch, she realized, protecting her even now. "Mr. Keller," she said softly, "thank you. Not just for helping me get my ring back, but for making me feel safe when I should be terrified." Preston's expression softened in the firelight. "You can call me Preston, and you don't need to thank me, Miss James." "Ruby," she corrected him. "If we're going to chase outlaws together, we might as well use first names." A smile tugged at his lips. "Fair enough. Get some rest, Ruby. I'll wake you at first light." Despite her racing thoughts, the gentle crackling of the fire and the rhythmic sounds of the wilderness eventually lulled Ruby to sleep. Her last conscious thought was that for the first time since her parents died, she didn't feel completely alone in the world. The next day brought challenges Ruby hadn't anticipated. Her muscles ached from the previous day's ride, and Preston insisted on teaching her the basics of horsemanship before they broke camp. "The sorrel's name is Daisy," he explained, helping Ruby into the saddle of the smaller horse. "She's gentle and steady, perfect for beginners." Ruby gripped the saddle horn tightly, feeling precarious despite Daisy's calm demeanor. "I'm going to fall off and break my neck," she predicted grimly. Preston laughed, the sound unexpectedly warm. "Not on my watch." "Here, hold the reins like this, not too tight, just enough to communicate with her." For the next hour, Preston patiently coached Ruby through the fundamentals of riding. By the time they set off again, she felt moderately more confident, though they traveled at a slower pace to accommodate her inexperience. "You're a natural," Preston encouraged as Ruby successfully navigated Daisy around a fallen log. "Most city folks take days to get comfortable in the saddle." Ruby flushed with pleasure at the compliment. "I had a good teacher." As they rode, Preston continued tracking the Blackwell gang, pointing out signs that Ruby would have missed entirely: a cigarette butt here, disturbed gravel there. By midday, the trail led them into increasingly rugged terrain, the mountains looming closer. "They're heading for Rattlesnake Pass," Preston said, frowning as he studied the horizon. "It's a common hideout for outlaws, difficult to access and easy to defend." "Is that bad news for us?" "It means we need to be extra careful," he replied. "If they've gone to ground in the pass, a direct approach would be suicide." The gravity of their situation struck Ruby anew. "Perhaps we should turn back," she suggested. "The ring isn't worth your life, Preston." He turned in his saddle to look at her, his expression serious. "This isn't just about the ring anymore, Ruby. The Blackwell gang has terrorized this territory for too long. They've hurt innocent people, stolen livelihoods, even killed a stagecoach driver last spring. Someone needs to stop them." "And that someone needs to be you?" she asked, worry creeping into her voice. "I have certain skills that make me well suited to the task." His tone suggested there was more to the story, but before Ruby could press him further, Preston raised his hand for silence. They had reached a ridge overlooking a narrow valley. Below them, nestled against the base of a rocky cliff, stood a crude cabin with smoke rising from its chimney. 3 horses were hitched outside, and a 4th grazed in a makeshift corral nearby. "That's them," Preston whispered, dismounting and helping Ruby down from Daisy. "We found their hideout." Ruby's heart raced as she peered over the ridge. "What do we do now?" Preston unsaddled the horses and secured them to a tree, well hidden from view. "Now we wait and observe. Learn their routines, find their weaknesses." He removed a spyglass from his saddlebag and studied the cabin. "There are only 3 of them visible, the leader and 2 others." "How will we get the ring back?" Ruby asked. Preston's expression turned grim. "Leave that to me. When night falls, I'll move closer to the cabin. You'll stay here with the horses." "Alone?" Ruby tried to keep the alarm from her voice. "It's safer," he insisted. "I can move more quickly and quietly by myself." Ruby wanted to argue but recognized the logic in his plan. Still, the thought of Preston facing 3 armed outlaws alone terrified her. They spent the afternoon watching the cabin from their vantage point, speaking little but growing increasingly comfortable in each other's silence. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the valley, Ruby found herself studying Preston's profile against the fading light. There was something about him that fascinated her, a depth of character, a quiet strength that seemed rare in a world where men often confused volume with worth. In just 2 days, he'd upended her expectations and shown her a side of the West she hadn't anticipated finding. "You're staring," Preston said without looking away from the spyglass. Ruby blushed. "I was just wondering why you're really doing this." "There must be more than simple kindness driving you." Preston was silent for so long that Ruby thought he might not answer. Finally, he lowered the spyglass and turned to face her. 5 years ago, the Blackwell gang raided a small homestead about 20 miles from my ranch," he said quietly. "A family named Winters. Good people, salt of the earth. They killed Mr. Winters when he tried to protect his wife. She survived but was never the same after." His jaw tightened. "Their daughter Sarah was just 16. She and I were close." Understanding dawned on Ruby. "You were courting her?" Preston nodded, his eyes distant with memory. We were to be married that spring. After the raid, she couldn't bear to stay in Montana, moved east to live with relatives in Pennsylvania. The pain in his voice was raw despite the passing years. The law never caught up with the Blackwell gang. They changed members over time, but the leader Jack Blackwell, he's still the same man who destroyed the Winters family, who took Sarah away. "I'm so sorry," Ruby whispered, reaching out instinctively to touch his arm. Preston covered her hand with his own briefly. "When I saw them take your ring, something precious to you, it brought it all back. I couldn't stand by and let them take something else from someone who didn't deserve that pain." The intimacy of his confession hung in the air between them. Ruby felt a connection to this man that defied their short acquaintance, a recognition of shared loss and resilience. "Thank you for telling me," she said softly. Preston cleared his throat, returning his attention to the cabin below. "It's almost dark. I'll move in closer once the moon rises. There's jerky and biscuits in my saddlebag if you get hungry." Ruby wanted to say more, to acknowledge the weight of what he'd shared, but Preston had already shifted back into the focused tracker who'd led them here. The moment for such intimacies had passed. As darkness fell completely, Preston prepared to descend into the valley. He checked his revolver, tucked a hunting knife into his boot, and donned a dark jacket that would help him blend into the shadows. "If I'm not back by dawn," he instructed Ruby, "take Daisy and ride east. You'll hit the main trail by midday, and from there it's a straight shot back to Granite." "I'm not leaving without you," Ruby said firmly. Preston's expression softened. "Ruby, no." She crossed her arms, surprising herself with her vehemence. "You didn't abandon me when my ring was stolen, and I won't abandon you now. We finish this together." A complex emotion crossed Preston's face: surprise, followed by something warmer that made Ruby's heart beat faster. "Stubborn woman," he murmured, but there was admiration in his tone. "Fine. If I'm not back by dawn, you can come looking for me, but carefully. Promise me that." Ruby nodded, relief flooding through her. "I promise." Preston hesitated, then reached out to touch her cheek gently. "For luck," he said quietly, before turning and disappearing into the darkness with a silence that spoke of years of wilderness experience. Alone on the ridge, Ruby wrapped herself in a blanket against the night chill and stared down at the distant lights of the cabin, her thoughts a turbulent mix of worry for Preston and newfound understanding of his motivations. He wasn't just helping her, he was seeking some measure of justice for a wound that had never properly healed. The hours crept by with agonizing slowness. Every sound in the darkness made Ruby jump, imagining Preston discovered, outgunned, wounded. She had never been the praying type, but that night, she found herself whispering desperate pleas to whatever higher power might be listening. Just when she thought she couldn't bear the suspense any longer, a figure materialized from the shadows beside her. Ruby nearly screamed before recognizing Preston's silhouette. "It's me," he whispered, crouching beside her. "Don't be alarmed." "Did you find it?" Ruby asked eagerly. "The ring." Preston's smile was visible even in the dim moonlight as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object. Ruby's heart leapt as he placed her mother's wedding ring in her palm, the gold band with its delicate rose engravings intact. "How did you?" she began, closing her fingers around the precious metal. "They were celebrating their successful robbery," Preston explained, "drinking heavily. The leader Blackwell, he had your ring on the table, boasting about how he'd taken it from a pretty little thing in Granite." His expression darkened. "I waited until they passed out drunk, then slipped in through the back window." "You could have been killed," Ruby whispered, the reality of his danger hitting her anew. "But I wasn't." Preston took her hand, squeezing it reassuringly. "And now you have your mother's ring back where it belongs." Ruby impulsively threw her arms around him, overwhelmed with gratitude. Preston stiffened in surprise before cautiously returning her embrace, his strong arms encircling her with a gentleness that made her throat tighten with emotion. "Thank you," she murmured against his shoulder. "I can never repay you for this." When they separated, something had changed between them, a boundary crossed, a connection deepened. Preston cleared his throat, suddenly looking uncomfortable with the intimacy of the moment. "We should move," he said, gathering their belongings. "When they wake up and discover the ring missing, they'll be looking for tracks." Ruby slipped the ring onto her finger for safekeeping as they prepared the horses. "Won't they follow us?" "Not immediately," Preston replied with a hint of satisfaction. "I may have." Borrowed their boots while they were sleeping, left them in a creek about half a mile away. Ruby's laughter bubbled up spontaneously. "You didn't—" Preston's answering grin was boyish and carefree, a side of him she hadn't yet seen. "I might have also taken the firing pins from their revolvers. Just to be safe." They mounted their horses and rode away from the ridge as the first hints of dawn lightened the eastern sky. Ruby felt lighter than she had in months, not just because of the recovered ring, but because of the man riding beside her, a man who had risked everything to keep a promise to a woman he barely knew. What she couldn't have anticipated was how the journey back to Granite would change everything between them, or how the Blackwell gang would not let this humiliation go unanswered. By mid-morning, Ruby and Preston had put considerable distance between themselves and the outlaw's cabin. They rode side by side now that Ruby had gained confidence on Daisy, and the conversation flowed more easily between them. "So you'll continue to Helena for your teaching position?" Preston asked as they followed a stream through a verdant valley. Ruby nodded, though the prospect no longer filled her with the same anticipation it had before. "The school term begins in 2 weeks. I've already signed a contract." "Helena's a fine city," Preston remarked, though something in his tone suggested he wasn't entirely pleased with her answer. "Growing quickly. You'll find more comforts there than in smaller settlements like Granite." "What about you?" Ruby asked. "Back to your ranch and horses," Preston nodded. "The spring foals need training and we've got a herd to move to summer pasture." He hesitated, then added, "Though Granite isn't far from Helena, just a day's ride. Perhaps I could visit occasionally, see how you're settling in." The suggestion sent a pleasant warmth through Ruby's chest. "I'd like that very much." Their eyes met briefly, and Ruby saw in Preston's gaze the same confusion and attraction she felt herself, an unexpected connection neither of them had been looking for. The moment was shattered by the distant sound of hoofbeats, multiple riders approaching fast from behind them. Preston's relaxed demeanor vanished instantly. "Ride," he commanded, spurring his buckskin into a gallop. "They've found us faster than I expected." Ruby urged Daisy forward, terror lending her skill she didn't know she possessed. They thundered across the valley toward a line of trees, but the pursuers were gaining ground. "The creek," Preston shouted, veering toward a rushing stream that cut through the landscape. "Follow it downstream. The water will hide our tracks." They splashed into the creek, the cold water reaching the horses' knees as they navigated the slippery stream bed. Behind them, angry shouts confirmed their worst fears. The Blackwell gang was in pursuit, and they were out for revenge. "There's a ravine ahead," Preston called over the noise of the water. "If we can reach it, there's a place to hide." Ruby clung to Daisy's mane as the sorrel picked her way through the stream. Her heart hammered against her ribs, and she was painfully aware of the ring on her finger, the object that had unwittingly made her a target. A gunshot cracked through the air, the bullet striking a tree trunk near Preston's head. More shots followed, forcing them to zigzag in the water, making themselves harder targets. They reached the ravine, a narrow cut between rocky walls that opened into a secluded hollow screened by thick pines. Preston led them deep into the shelter, finally stopping in a small clearing invisible from the ravine entrance. "Dismount," he whispered, helping Ruby down. "We need to stay quiet." They stood motionless beside their panting horses, listening as the sounds of pursuit grew closer, then paused. "They've lost our trail at the creek," Preston murmured, "but they'll keep searching." Ruby's hands trembled as she clutched Daisy's reins. "This is my fault. If I hadn't insisted on coming with you—" "No," Preston cut her off firmly. "This was always a possibility. The important thing is that we got your ring back, and now we just need to outfox them long enough to reach safety." A twig snapped nearby, and both froze. Voices drifted through the trees. The outlaws had entered the ravine and were searching methodically. Preston drew his revolver, positioning himself protectively in front of Ruby. "If they find us," he whispered, "I'll create a diversion. When I do, you ride hard for Granite. Don't look back, no matter what you hear." "I'm not leaving you," Ruby insisted, her voice barely audible. Preston turned to face her, his expression intense. "Ruby, please. I couldn't bear it if anything happened to you." The raw emotion in his voice startled her. This was more than the concern of a good Samaritan for someone in his care. This was personal, deep, and real. Before she could respond, a shout from outside their hiding place announced discovery. "Tracks, fresh ones leading this way." Preston made a split-second decision. "Change of plans. We ride together now." They mounted quickly, and Preston led them deeper into the ravine, away from the main entrance. The path narrowed until it seemed they'd reach a dead end, but Preston pressed on confidently until they emerged on the other side of the ridge. "How did you know this way out?" Ruby asked as they urged their horses to a gallop again. "I told you I know these mountains better than they do," Preston called back, a fierce grin lighting his face despite the danger. They rode hard for hours, changing direction frequently to confuse any pursuit. By late afternoon, they had reached familiar territory, rolling grasslands that Preston identified as the northern edge of his ranch. "We're safe now," he assured Ruby as they slowed their exhausted horses to a walk. "My ranch hands patrol these borders regularly. The Blackwell gang won't dare follow us here." Relief washed over Ruby, leaving her light-headed and giddy. They had escaped. The ring was safe on her finger, and Preston, brave, determined Preston, was unharmed. "Is your ranch house nearby?" she asked, suddenly aware of her disheveled appearance and the grime of 2 days' hard travel. Preston nodded. "Just over that rise. We can rest there tonight, and tomorrow I'll escort you back to Granite." He glanced at her with a hint of uncertainty. "If that's agreeable to you." "Very agreeable," Ruby replied with a smile. As they crested the hill, the Keller ranch spread before them, a sprawling complex of buildings surrounded by fenced pastures, where dozens of horses grazed in the late afternoon sunlight. The main house was larger than Ruby had expected, built of solid logs with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. Several ranch hands noticed their approach and waved in greeting, one running ahead to alert the household of their arrival. By the time they reached the yard, a middle-aged woman with a kind face and flour-dusted hands had emerged onto the porch. "Preston Keller. We've been worried sick," she called, wiping her hands on her apron. "Sheriff Calloway sent word about the stagecoach robbery and said you'd gone after those outlaws." "Sorry to worry you, Mrs. Cooper," Preston replied as he dismounted and helped Ruby down from Daisy. "We had a bit of an adventure. This is Miss Ruby James. She'll be staying with us tonight." "Mrs. Cooper." Evidently, the housekeeper assessed Ruby with shrewd but kind eyes. "Any friend of Mr. Keller's is welcome here. I'll have hot water sent up for a bath right away, and there's stew on the stove." The next hour passed in a blur for Ruby. She was shown to a comfortable guest room, provided with hot water and clean towels, and left to wash away the dust and fear of the past 2 days. One of the ranch hands had retrieved her trunk from the stagecoach office in Granite, so she even had fresh clothes to change into. By the time she descended to the dining room, feeling human again in a clean green dress with her hair properly arranged, Preston was waiting for her. He too had bathed and changed, and Ruby's breath caught at the sight of him in a crisp white shirt and dark vest, his damp hair combed neatly back from his forehead. "You look," he began, then seemed to lose his train of thought. Ruby felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "Thank you for arranging to have my trunk brought here. It was very thoughtful." Preston cleared his throat. "It seemed the least I could do after dragging you through the wilderness." He pulled out a chair for her at the large oak dining table. "I hope you're hungry, Mrs. Cooper is the best cook in 3 counties." Dinner was a revelation: tender beef stew, fresh baked bread, and apple pie still warm from the oven. Ruby hadn't realized how hungry she was until the food was before her. They ate in companionable silence for a while before Preston spoke again. "Sheriff Calloway sent a telegram," he said, his expression serious once more. "He's formed a proper posse and gone after the Blackwell gang with deputies from 3 counties. With luck, they'll be behind bars before you reach Helena." Ruby's hand went instinctively to the ring on her finger. "I hope so. I'd hate to think of them hurting anyone else." After dinner, Preston suggested a tour of the ranch. As the sunset painted the Montana sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, he showed Ruby the stables where his prized horses were housed, the corrals where young colts frolicked, and finally, a hilltop overlooking the entire property. "It's beautiful," Ruby said sincerely as they stood side by side, watching the last light fade from the sky. "You've built something remarkable here." Preston's gaze remained on the horizon. "My father started it, but yes, I've expanded it considerably." Pride colored his voice. "We supply cavalry mounts to the army and working horses to ranches throughout the territory. Next year, I hope to begin breeding race horses as well." "You love it," Ruby observed. "This land, these animals, it's not just work to you." Preston turned to look at her then, surprise and appreciation in his eyes. "Most people see only the business aspect, but you're right, I do love it. This land gets in your blood, becomes part of you." The intensity of his gaze made Ruby's heart beat faster. Standing there in the gathering twilight, she found herself wishing that the journey to Helena could be delayed indefinitely, that she could stay in this moment and on this ranch longer than just one night. "Ruby," Preston said softly, taking a step closer. "I know we've only known each other for a few days, but a shout from the ranch yard below interrupted whatever he'd been about to say. One of the ranch hands was calling for Preston, urgency in his voice. "Mr. Keller, riders coming in fast from the north." Preston's expression hardened instantly. "Get back to the house," he told Ruby, all tenderness gone from his voice. "Now." They hurried down the hill toward the main house, where several ranch hands had gathered with rifles at the ready. As they reached the yard, a group of riders thundered through the main gate, but it wasn't the Blackwell gang as Ruby had feared. Sheriff Calloway led the group, his badge gleaming in the last light. Beside him rode several deputies, and in their midst, 3 men on horseback with their hands bound. "Preston," the sheriff called, reining in his horse. "Thought you'd want to know we caught them. The whole Blackwell gang trying to cross into Idaho territory." Relief flooded through Ruby as she recognized the sullen faces of the captured outlaws, including the leader who had taken her ring. The men were dirty, bruised, and thoroughly defeated looking. "Miss James," Sheriff Calloway continued, noticing her presence. "Good to see you safe. We'll need you to come to Granite tomorrow to give a formal statement if you would." Ruby nodded, unable to take her eyes off the captured men. One of them, the leader, stared back at her with naked hatred in his eyes. "You think you've won," he spat, "but this ain't over. Not by a long shot." Preston stepped protectively closer to Ruby. "It's over for you, Blackwell. You'll hang for what you've done." The sheriff's posse moved on toward Granite with their prisoners, leaving a subdued atmosphere at the ranch despite the good news. The encounter had reminded Ruby that her adventure wasn't a story from a dime novel. Real people had been hurt, and real dangers still existed. That night, sleep eluded her despite the comfortable bed. She found herself drawn to the window, gazing out at the starlit ranch yard below. To her surprise, she spotted Preston sitting alone on the porch steps, apparently as restless as she was. Acting on impulse, Ruby wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and made her way quietly downstairs and outside. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked softly as she approached. Preston looked up, surprised but not displeased to see her. "Too much on my mind, I suppose." Ruby sat beside him on the step, leaving a respectable distance between them. "They caught them. It's over." "Yes," Preston agreed, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. They sat in silence for a moment, the night sounds of the ranch horses nickering softly in the stables, the distant howl of a coyote creating a peaceful backdrop to their thoughts. "What were you going to say?" Ruby asked finally. "Up on the hill before we were interrupted." Preston turned to look at her, his expression difficult to read in the dim light from the house windows. "I was going to say that I've never met anyone quite like you, Ruby James. Most women would have been content to let the law handle their stolen property, or at least stayed safely behind while someone else did the dangerous work." "I'm not most women," Ruby replied with a small smile. "No," Preston agreed, his voice dropping lower. "You certainly are not." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and took her hand in his. His thumb brushed over her mother's ring, now safely back on her finger where it belonged. "Tomorrow I'll take you back to Granite," he said. "And the day after, you'll be on your way to Helena to begin your teaching position." Ruby nodded, suddenly finding it difficult to speak past the lump in her throat. "But I'd like to see you again," Preston continued. "If you're amenable. Helena isn't so far that I couldn't visit. Perhaps write to you in between visits." Hope blossomed in Ruby's chest, bright and unexpected. "I'd like that very much," she whispered. Preston's smile was slow and warm, transforming his face in the moonlight. His free hand came up to gently touch her cheek, and Ruby found herself leaning into the contact. "May I?" he asked softly, his gaze dropping to her lips. In answer, Ruby closed the distance between them, pressing her lips gently to his. The kiss was brief, but perfect, a promise of possibilities neither of them had imagined 3 days ago when fate brought them together on a dusty street in Granite. When they parted, Preston's eyes held a new light. "I meant what I said, you know," he murmured. "When you told me he took your ring and I said I'd forge you another from Hope, I may not be a blacksmith, but I believe some promises are forged in moments that change us forever." Ruby's fingers interlaced with his. "This moment," Preston nodded. "This moment. And all the ones that brought us here." They stayed on the porch steps talking until the eastern sky began to lighten, sharing stories of their pasts and tentative dreams of the future. By the time the ranch began to stir with morning activities, something new had been born between them, something neither had been looking for, but both now treasured. The journey back to Granite the next day was peaceful compared to their previous adventures. They rode side by side, no longer pursued, no longer strangers. In town, Ruby gave her statement to Sheriff Calloway, formally identifying the Blackwell gang members and recounting how her ring had been stolen and recovered. "You two make quite a team," the sheriff remarked as he closed his notebook. "Though I can't say I approve of civilians taking the law into their own hands, Keller." Preston's expression remained neutral. "Sometimes the law needs a helping hand, Sheriff. No disrespect intended." Calloway harumphed, but didn't argue the point further. "Well, Miss James, you'll be pleased to know the judge will be here next week. Those outlaws will stand trial, and with your testimony, they'll likely hang or spend the rest of their days in prison." Ruby felt a complex mix of emotions at this news: satisfaction that justice would be served, but no joy in the thought of men dying, even men as disreputable as the Blackwell gang. "What will you do now?" the sheriff asked. "Continue to Helena as planned." Before Ruby could answer, Preston spoke up. "Actually, Sheriff, if Miss James is amenable, I'd like to suggest an alternative." Ruby turned to him in surprise. This was the first she'd heard of any alternative plan. "The schoolteacher position in Granite has been vacant since Miss Thornton married last fall," Preston continued. "The town council has been seeking a replacement, but qualified teachers are scarce in the territory." Sheriff Calloway's eyebrows rose. "Are you suggesting Miss James apply for the position here instead of going to Helena?" Preston looked at Ruby, his expression a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "Only if she wishes to consider it. Granite is smaller than Helena, of course, but it's a good community. Growing. And—" He hesitated, then finished simply, "closer to my ranch." Ruby's heart raced at the implication. "But my contract in Helena could likely be transferred," Preston suggested. "Especially if the territorial superintendent learns that Granite has finally found a qualified teacher. He's been pressuring Helena to share educational resources with smaller settlements." The possibility unfurled before Ruby like a map to an unexpected destination. Granite wasn't what she had planned, but in the few days she'd spent here and in the surrounding countryside, she'd experienced more life, more connection, than in months of mourning in Ohio. And then there was Preston Steady, Honorable Preston, who had risked his life to recover a stranger's keepsake and in the process had given her something far more valuable. A reason to consider a different future than the one she'd mapped out. "I'll need to think about it," Ruby said carefully, though inside, her mind was already racing ahead to possibilities she hadn't considered before. Preston nodded, respecting her caution. "Of course, there's no rush to decide." But by the time they left the sheriff's office, walking together down Granite's main street in the warm afternoon sunlight, Ruby found her decision was already made. Something about this town, this territory, this man felt right in a way nothing had since before her parents' death. "I'd like to apply for the position here," she said as they reached Mrs. Hollister's boarding house. "If the offer is genuine." Preston's face lit up with undisguised joy. "It is. I'm on the town council. I can arrange for you to meet the other members tomorrow." Ruby laughed, suddenly giddy with the boldness of her choice. "You seem very certain they'll approve my application." "They'd be fools not to," Preston replied with a warmth that made her blush. "But even if for some reason they didn't, Helena is still an option. Either way." He took her hand, his expression turning serious. "Either way, I'd like to continue seeing you, Ruby James, if you'll allow it." Ruby squeezed his hand, her mother's ring catching the sunlight between them, the small circle of gold that had brought them together, and now seemed to symbolize a different kind of circle, one just beginning to form. "I'd like that too," she said softly. In the days that followed, Ruby's life transformed with breathtaking speed. The Granite Town Council unanimously approved her application to become the town's new teacher, and a telegram to the territorial superintendent secured her release from the Helena contract. Mrs. Hollister offered her a permanent room at the boarding house at a reduced rate for our new schoolmarm, and the ladies of Granite organized a welcome social to introduce her to the community. Throughout it all, Preston was a steady presence escorting her to meetings, helping to prepare the long-closed schoolhouse for the coming term, and courting her with a quiet determination that charmed not only Ruby but the entire town. Their courtship progressed with the same blend of caution and adventure that had marked their first meeting. Preston taught Ruby to ride properly, and soon she was accompanying him on weekend trips to his ranch, where she developed a genuine affection for the horses and the land he loved so deeply. In turn, Ruby shared with Preston her love of literature and learning. Often, they would sit on Mrs. Hollister's porch in the evenings, Ruby reading aloud from Dickens or Twain while Preston listened, sometimes offering surprisingly insightful observations that revealed the thoughtful mind behind his practical exterior. As summer turned to autumn, and the school term began with 20 eager, and some not so eager, students under Ruby's care, she found herself settling into Granite as if she'd always belonged there. The initial stares and whispers that had accompanied her dramatic arrival had given way to genuine acceptance, with many townsfolk expressing their gratitude that Preston Keller finally found himself a good woman. One crisp October evening, nearly 6 months after their first meeting, Preston invited Ruby for a special dinner at his ranch. Mrs. Cooper had outdone herself with the meal, and afterward, Preston suggested a walk to the hilltop where they'd nearly shared their first moment of true connection. The Montana sunset was spectacular, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. As they stood side by side admiring the view, Preston seemed uncharacteristically nervous. "You remember what I said when you told me the outlaw had taken your mother's ring?" he asked suddenly. Ruby smiled at the memory. "You said you'd forge me another from Hope." Preston turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "I meant it, Ruby. That day changed everything for me. After Sarah left, I thought I'd never feel that way about anyone again. I threw myself into building this ranch, convinced that it was enough that I was better off alone." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object. "But then you arrived in Granite, and suddenly the future looked different, brighter." Ruby's breath caught as Preston opened his palm to reveal a ring not her mother's simple band, but a new one crafted of gold with a small diamond set among delicately engraved roses that echoed the pattern on her mother's ring. "I had it made in Helena," Preston explained, his voice rough with emotion. "The roses are like your mother's ring, but the design is new, our own beginning while honoring what came before." He dropped to one knee, still holding her hands. "Ruby James, I know 6 months isn't a lifetime, but I've seen your courage, your kindness, your strength. I've watched you build a life here in Granite, winning over everyone from the schoolchildren to old Mrs. Harrison who hasn't liked anyone in 30 years. This drew a watery laugh from Ruby. "I love you. Will you marry me?" Tears spilled down Ruby's cheeks as she nodded, unable to speak past the emotion clogging her throat. When she finally found her voice, it was barely above a whisper. "Yes, Preston. Yes, I'll marry you." His smile was radiant as he slipped the ring onto her finger beside her mother's band. When he stood and pulled her into his arms, their kiss was filled with all the promise of the future they would build together, a future neither of them could have imagined that day on the dusty street of Granite when fate and a band of outlaws brought them together. They were married in the Granite church the following spring, with the entire town in attendance. Ruby wore her mother's ring on her right hand and Preston's engagement ring on her left, symbolic of the way she had found a way to honor her past while embracing her future. Sheriff Calloway, who had become a good friend to them both, served as Preston's best man. "Never thought I'd see the day," he commented during the reception. Preston Keller, the most self-sufficient man in Montana territory, looking at a woman like she hung the moon and stars. Ruby laughed, glancing across the room to where her new husband was deep in conversation with some of his ranch hands. As if sensing her gaze, Preston looked up, his eyes finding hers instantly. The love in his expression made her heart swell with happiness. "I'm a fortunate woman," she told the sheriff simply. "And he's a fortunate man," Calloway replied. "You two were meant to find each other, though it took a band of outlaws to make it happen." Ruby touched her mother's ring thoughtfully. "Sometimes the worst moments lead us to the best places," she said. "If the Blackwell gang hadn't robbed that stagecoach, I would have continued to Helena, and Preston and I might never have met." "Speaking of the Blackwell gang," the sheriff said, lowering his voice, "I received word yesterday. The appeals were denied. The hangings are scheduled for next week in Helena." Ruby felt a pang of complex emotions. "I can't rejoice in any man's death, Sheriff, even men who did such harm, but I am glad they won't hurt anyone else." The sheriff nodded in understanding. "You've got a good heart, Mrs. Keller. It's one of the reasons you make such a fine teacher." Later that evening, as Preston drove their wagon toward the ranch that would now be their shared home, Ruby nestled against his side in the cool spring air. "Happy?" he asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Completely," she replied, "though I can hardly believe how much has changed in a year. When I left Ohio, I thought I was traveling toward a new beginning, but I had no idea what that really meant." Preston's arm tightened around her shoulders. "Life has a way of surprising us. I certainly never expected to chase down outlaws and find a wife in the same adventure." Ruby laughed, looking down at the two rings that now adorned her hands, one representing her past, the other her future. Both precious, both part of the woman she had become. "You kept your promise," she said softly. "That day in Granite when I told you he took my ring." Preston glanced down at her, his eyes reflecting the starlight. "Which promise was that? You said you'd forge me another from Hope." Ruby touched the engagement ring with its diamond and engraved roses. "And you did." Preston's smile was tender as he guided the horses around a bend in the road, bringing their ranch house into view. Lights glowed welcomingly in the windows where Mrs. Cooper had prepared for their return. "Hope, love, and a fair bit of Montana stubbornness," Preston corrected with a chuckle. "All forged into something that will last a lifetime." As they approached their home, their future, Ruby knew with absolute certainty that the unexpected journey that had brought her to Montana had led her exactly where she was meant to be. Not to Helena as she'd planned, but to Granite, to a schoolhouse full of children who needed her, and to a man who had risked everything to recover a simple gold ring and had given her a new one filled with promise in return. The ranch house grew closer, its windows glowing with welcome. Behind them, the town of Granite nestled in the valley, and all around, the vast Montana landscape stretched under a canopy of stars, wild, beautiful, and full of possibilities, just like the life they would build together. "Home," Preston said simply as he drew the wagon to a halt before the house. Ruby squeezed his hand, her heart full. "Home," she agreed, and it was. In the years that followed, the story of how Preston Keller had chased down the notorious Blackwell gang to recover Ruby James's ring became something of a legend in Granite and the surrounding settlements. The tale grew with each retelling, of course the number of outlaws increasing, the dangers more dramatic, the romance more faded, but at its heart remained the simple truth. A brave cowboy had forged hope into love, and in doing so, had changed 2 lives forever. Ruby continued teaching at the Granite School for many years, beloved by generations of students who passed through her classroom. Preston's horse ranch flourished under their joint care, expanding to become one of the most respected breeding operations in the territory. Together, they built a life rich with purpose, community, and deep abiding love. They had 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter who grew up strong and capable under the big Montana sky, learning both Ruby's love of knowledge and Preston's affinity for horses and land. On their 20th wedding anniversary, their children presented them with a hand-drawn family tree, the branches spreading wide from the strong roots they had established together. "Not bad," Preston murmured that night as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, the family tree spread across their laps. "For 2 people who met because of a stagecoach robbery." Ruby leaned her head against his shoulder, the gold of her 2 rings catching the last light of day. "The best things often come from the most unexpected beginnings," she replied. Preston's arm around her was as steady and strong as it had been on that first wild ride through the Montana wilderness, when a determined cowboy and a brave schoolteacher had forged a bond stronger than gold from the unlikeliest of circumstances. And as the sun set over the ranch they had built together, Ruby knew that their story, like her mother's ring and the one Preston had given her, would endure long after they were gone. A testament to the power of hope transformed by love into something precious and everlasting.